What I'd like to do is talk about why so many people in so many countries have been frustrated and disappointed by this era of globalization, why they are rejecting it. And the data are quite striking. Just thinking about the United States, 40% of Americans believe globalization is a force for good. 60% of Americans believe globalization is a force for bad in the world. 37% of French citizens believe globalization is a force for good in the world, which of course means 63% believe that globalization is a force for bad. So this is not just in the United States, it's very much across Europe and in a number of developing countries as well. So the question is, why are people rejecting this thing that we call globalization? And how should we make sense of it? And I think most importantly, what are we going to do about it? Because if the people who have benefited most from globalization, which is to say all of us, and here I include myself, if the people who have benefited are not going to come to its defense in a robust way and restore its legitimacy in the eyes of the people who share our same color passports, who in many countries get to vote on what happens next, then who else is going to do it? So let me share with you some images and some data to help orient our conversation about what's going on in the world and why we have this backlash. Let me also just say, I would be delighted for you to use the chat as much as you feel comfortable. This is, I think, a very connective thing. We all hate Zoom, right? Like it's a great program, it's an important tool, but boy, am I going to be glad when we're on Zoom less, though there is one thing I will miss. I'm going to miss Zoom chat. So let's just imagine for a moment, we were on campus, which we will be soon, and having a conversation about this. And I think probably it will still be important for us to have a conversation about these topics. And you were in, I don't know, Aldrich Hall or some other classroom auditorium-like space. I would have no idea what was on your minds while you were listening, while you were thinking about some of these ideas. I can't read your minds. I mean, mostly. But with Zoom chat, it's like a little opportunity for me and for all of us to sort of see the thought bubbles coming up and see your reactions moment by moment, idea by idea. So please, absolutely, use the Zoom chat, interrupt me with questions in the Q&A box. I will try to keep up with the Zoom chat as well as I can and answer questions as I go. I would love for this not to just be like me talking and nobody reacting. So as much as you can, please do. And Jose, thank you for that little observation. Here's my email address. There you go. Don't be shy. And let's get started. So let me just start by talking a little bit about, and thank you, Katie, that's very sweet of you, and talk a little bit about how we got here and what I mean when I talk about this era of globalization and ways in which it might be evolving. So I've put together some data. It's a kind of composite of data that measure the integration of markets across the borders of sovereign states. So markets for goods, markets for services, markets for capital. I'm not including in this collection of data markets for labor. So most of the other factors. And between 1870 and 1914, if we take a sort of composite of those data, we can see how well integrated the global economy was during that time. It was the first great age of globalization. And if we were having this conversation in, let's say, 1911, 1912, and I asked you whether that era of globalization, the one through which we would have been living, would last, most of you wouldn't have imagined it was a sensible question to even pose. Why wouldn't it? What an extraordinary era it was. It was so good for business. It was so good for firms spreading their wings, spreading capitalism all around the world. And we would have imagined that, of course, it would last. Of course, it would be an era that should be preserved. And it didn't. It didn't last. It was destroyed, that first great era of globalization. The first blow against that era of globalization came in August 1914 with the outbreak of war in Europe. That war spread around much of the world, the First World War. After the war, there was an effort to rebuild an era of globalization, to restore the integration of markets for goods and services and capital, to create a new world of global capitalism that had resembled the one that came before the war. And that effort failed. The financial chaos of the 1920s, rising populist backlash against globalization, against the elites, against the political establishment, against who we are actually. Then the great stock market crash of 1929 in the United States, which was followed by equity market crashes all around the world. The rise of trade protectionism in the United States in 1931, which was followed by trade protectionism all around the world. The destruction of the global trading order, the Great Depression. Further rise of both left-wing populism and right-wing populism. And then the Second World War, by the end of which we had definitively destroyed this era of globalization. And Roberta, thank you for that question. This is and just as a reminder, and I'm sure Kelly would prefer for me to mention this, great if you can put these questions in the Q&A box. And so the chat can be like among us and the questions can be directed directly toward me. But this is a collection of measures, and I've smoothed out the lines that measure capital market integration, so interest rate differentials and capital controls, that measure goods and services market integration. So trade barriers, non-tariff barriers, and really just how well goods and services can move across the borders of sovereign states. So it's a narrow economistic definition of globalization, Roberta. It's not about ideas, it's not about ideologies, it's just about how well goods, services, and capital move across the borders of sovereign states. And in our lifetimes, we have witnessed and lived through the emergence of another great era of globalization, which by any measure that's focused on goods markets, services markets, and capital markets rivals that first great era of globalization. Great question, Daniel. Great question. Let me just share one other thought and come back to your question. So as we are living through this era of globalization and witnessing this backlash against globalization, one of the questions that's on my mind is where we're headed next. And so I am not a predictor of the future. The future prediction business is a business model for lunatics, and I'm no lunatic. But we can think in terms of scenarios. So the blue shaded line, what if it were possible to create even more globalization in the next 15 or 20 years than we've had in the previous 15 or 20 years? What if we can sustain this era of globalization so that we keep about as much market integration across the borders of sovereign states as we have today? But what if we are entering an era of deglobalization, of fragmentation? What if we are in the process of destroying it? And it's that scenario that I'd like to discuss today, because I think the probability of that nice blue shaded line in which we get more globalization than we have had over the past 15 or 20 years, probability of that, and you should use your own probabilities, like who knows, I'm thinking 10%, not higher than that. Maybe we save this era of globalization. We keep about as much globalization as we have today. I'm thinking maybe a 40% chance of that. It would take a lot of work, which means, you know, based on that little bit of amateur math, I think we've got a 50% chance of destroying this era of globalization. Maybe not like a total collapse as we had after the end of the First Great War, but some new era of fragmentation, of greater trade barriers, greater barriers to movements of goods, services, and capital. Now, Daniel, it's a great question. Like, why was there so little progress between 1945 and 1980? And one of the reasons for that was that we, not us, you and me, Daniel. I mean, I don't know your age, and I know my age, which is I wasn't like around then, but we collectively had a view that globalization was actually dangerous for the stability of capitalism. Like, we had a view that it was safer in a variety of ways to keep capital domestic, to keep finance domestic, actually to create an inclusive sort of capitalism that wasn't hyperactive, as it were. It wasn't like the globalization that we had in the 1910s and the 1920s. So part of the story is that in the 1980s, we decided that it was safe again to recreate globalization, to restore the principle of free movement of goods and services and capital. Now, Steve raises a great question about how many commonly borne costs there are associated with this era of globalization. And I think there's a paradox here, actually, which is that it is precisely at the moment when the challenges that the world faces are most international, most cross-national, most in need of cross-national collaboration. It is precisely at this moment that cross-national collaboration is failing us. And so part of the story that I would like to explore is how important it is to restore a sense of internationalism, of cosmopolitanism, in order to meet these great challenges. Great question, Roberta. I'm definitely going to come to that. And David, that is much on my mind. What are the engines of destruction? Let me move on to what I think are actually the engines of destruction. And the argument that I'd like to make to you today is that the engines of destruction in the 1920s and the 1930s are the same engines of destruction that we have today, which doesn't make anything inevitable, but does mean that if we do not meet the challenges that our parents and grandparents failed to meet the last time we had these engines of destruction, then we will end up destroying this era of globalization. So how should we think about these, and what are the key challenges? And let me share some thoughts. One of them, and David makes this point, and I think it is part of the story, which is that we were living through a global economy that was already in flux. And Stever, I hope you see the shout out from Gina in the chat because she is excited to see you. So, the rise and fall of great powers. Great power transitions. We are living through one. It's exciting in a wide variety of ways to live through a great power transition. We are living through the relative decline of the United States and the relative decline of Europe. So broadly speaking, the relative decline of the West. What I've done here in this chart is something very simple, which is I've taken national output as a share of world output at nominal exchange rates. So not adjusting for local prices. And that's one way to measure how large a country is. It's one way to measure what a great power is. So if we examine national output as a share of world output, or in the case of the EU as a whole, the regional output as a share of world output, we're clearly living through a moment in which the center of gravity in the world, at least economically speaking, is moving away from the West and toward the East. And so part of the story of our era is the return of China to the center of the global system. Now, again, these data are at nominal exchange rates, and forgive me the biggie nerdiness, there's going to be a little bit more of that, I'm afraid. If we use purchasing power parity exchange rates, China is already the largest economy in the world. At nominal exchange rates, China is the second largest national economy in the world. At nominal exchange rates, China's number 2, the United States is number 1. We're clearly not moving into a Sino-centric world in which China is at the center of the global system by itself, like the US-centric world that we had during the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, and in some ways leading up to the present moment. But what we are living through is a transition from a US-centric world to a world with 2 great powers: the United States and China, of roughly equal economic size and with very different visions about how the world economy ought to be organized. And it is that tension between the United States and China that is one of the key challenges facing the stability of the system. Now, this global system, this era of globalization, as we all know, was for a time shut down during parts of the past 18 months with moments of lockdown and restriction of economic activity. This is just an image from, an aerial image from Paris, from the traffic circle around the Arc de Triomphe. I don't know how many of you have ever made your way to Paris. I hope all of you, and if you haven't yet, certainly I hope that you will one day. But for anyone who's spent any time in Paris, this traffic circle never looks like this at any time of day. And this is what it looked like during a moment of lockdown. The images from New York, from Shanghai, from Beijing, from London, like shocking, just as a sort of visualization of what it meant to shut everything down. And this was a world that was already awash in debt. And there is a wide variety of ways we could measure how much debt there is in the world economy. We could look at household debt, corporate debt, sovereign debt. In this chart, I've just taken international debt securities as a share of world GDP, and we can see the sharp increase in the amount of indebtedness, like global indebtedness, during the past 30 or so years. You could put corporate debt on this chart and it would look the same in terms of the slope of the line. Household debt the same, sovereign debt absolutely the same. So we have been building a global economy that has as one of its fragile foundations indebtedness as a driver of how we organize growth in the world. Some great questions coming up, and thinking about Donald's question about how much globalization depends on the United States. I think quite a lot, actually. I think if the United States were to reject fundamentally globalization, it would be very difficult for the rest of the world to continue on with a single economic space while the United States sort of withdrew. And if we take the backlash in Europe as another example, absolutely, we're talking about like 40%, 45% of world GDP. One of the questions for us is, will the backlash in the United States and in Europe kind of ruin the party for everybody else, for China, for India, for emerging markets that have benefited from the opportunities created by globalization? Ricardo, great question. These are all great questions. We're not going to be able to get to all of them. But Ricardo, do I feel corporations need to act along with governments to pave the road ahead? Absolutely. Like, this is not going to be saved from the top down by governments. If we're going to save globalization, it's going to be from the bottom up. And I have a few ideas about that I'd like to share with you as we go. And William, yes, the Indian economy is still not that big as a share of world GDP, but it is one of the powers on the rise, right? So the United States is certainly experiencing relative decline, not absolute decline, but relative decline, just as a share of world output. But we see the countries that are on the rise, that are increasing their share of world output. And India is a country of the future in that way, as is China, as is a wide variety of countries in Africa, in Latin America, in Southeast Asia, Northeast Asia. Now, all of this was also happening amidst what we might call an era of epistemological fragmentation. And Fred has raised a question in the chat, and Daniel Dixon did as well, about the minimum tax rate. I think we should talk about that. Let's see if we can hold on to that question for a little bit as we think about what might happen next, but I don't think it's the primary answer. It might be useful for other reasons. We'll come back to that though. Now, I'm gonna make a suggestion to you. I've got a great phrase for your next dinner party, especially your next in-person dinner party. So what do I mean by epistemological fragmentation? Epistemology is the branch of Western philosophy that deals with how we know what is true and what is not true. One of the great promises of this era of globalization in ideas, of the information technology revolution, at least the way I understood it 20 years ago, was that the ease of the movement of information could create for us a single epistemological space in the world, which is to say, we would all know the same things. We would all believe the same things because we would have the same access to information, the same access to data, the same access to ideas. And not only did we not get that, we got the opposite, which is to say, we received a renewed ability to believe only what we want to believe, to curate our information spaces, our epistemological spaces, so thoroughly that nation by nation, city by city, household by household, person by person, we could live in the information space that we preferred. Now, this is partly a result of the information technology revolution and social media and all of that. But one thing I'd like to remind us is that it is definitely possible for us to fragment epistemological space without social media, without information technology. And let me just give you one example of how we know that's true. So the last time globalization broke was in the 1920s and 1930s. And it was during that era that people stopped believing in the same truth, stopped sharing the same epistemological space. And there was no Twitter, there was no Facebook, there was no YouTube during that time. Hannah Arendt, the great political philosopher, described that moment, which sounds so much like today. In an ever-changing, incomprehensible world, the masses had reached the point where they would at the same time believe everything and nothing, think that everything was true, and everything was possible and nothing was true. So that sounds a lot like the world in which we're living. And that was the pre-Twitter, pre-Facebook world. So it is absolutely possible for us to do this without social media, but social media has magnified this challenge. Now, bringing us even more up to the present moment. Before the pandemic struck, we were living in a very unequal world. And the pandemic era has magnified every inequality that we had before the pandemic struck. Gender inequality has been magnified. Racial and ethnic inequality magnified. Income and wealth inequality also magnified. And this is part of the story of the backlash, but not the full story. So these are data from the United States. Going back to 1910. And I know this is a bit busy and we're entering like a rather nerdy phase of this, but let me just read this with you from the bottom right up. So today, more or less, and thinking about just what the United States looks like, but the shape of this chart looks very similar for many, many countries in the world. So the top 0.01% of income earners in the United States today earns about 5% of national income. That's 0.01, not 1%. The top 1% of income earners in the United States today earns 22% of national income. The top 5% of income earners in the United States earns 38.5% of national income, and the top 10% of income earners in the United States earns more than 50% of national income. So just try to picture it, like top 10% earns 50, and then the other 90% share the other 50% of national income. It's a lot of income inequality, obviously. It wasn't always this way. So if this is not a historical constant, Steve, so if we look at the data for the United States going back to 1910, we can see that we've lived through a very sharp increase in income inequality in the United States. And between, let's say, 1945 and 1985, the United States looked very different, and indeed most countries looked very different. So in that era, and this is not ancient history, this is just 30 or 40 years ago, the top 1% of income earners didn't earn 22%, it earned 8.86%. The top 10% of income earners didn't earn 50% of national income, it earned 32% of national income. So not very long ago, the world looked very, very different. And it is only during this age of globalization that we have witnessed an increase in income inequality within nations, including the United States. These are the data I'm presenting here, that brings us back to how the world looked in the 1920s. So if we go back in time, we can find another moment when the world was this unequal. The last time the top 1% of income earners in the United States earned more than 22% of national income. The last time that the top 10% of income earners in the United States earned more than 50% of national income. And that year was 1929. That was the last time the world was this unequal. So this is part of our story. And Gerd, thank you for raising this question. It's only part of our story. Right now, we're just thinking about the landscape. Here's a fact. The last time the world was this unequal, globalization broke. That's an undeniable fact, but it's not the whole story. And there are some reasons why it's not the whole story. Because the frustration and the backlash against globalization is not just a story about income inequality. It's no master variable that explains the world, but it is part of the story. And let's elaborate a little bit more of what's going on. And some great questions. So Timur asks, like, taking into account distribution and redistribution when looking at income inequality. Yeah, absolutely. That's an important part of our story. And we're not talking about what the elites feel like might be unfair, but also what the rest of our fellow citizens believe is unfair. Now, what caused some interesting questions about what caused this rising income inequality? There's no one single cause. Globalization is part of that story. Technological change is part of that story. Increasing returns through talent and education is another part of that story. So we know that income inequality has gone up by a lot, but what else do we need to know in order to make sense of why people are so frustrated, why there is this backlash? So what I've done in this chart is report some data. I didn't do this statistical analysis myself, but I've put it in this lovely chart. And essentially, these data measure the correlation between parental income and children's income across countries at a moment in time. So more or less today. And so at one extreme, and so let's just read this together, we have a high correlation between parental income and children's income, which means we have low intergenerational class mobility. I'll come to that, Roberta, in a moment. Roberta is wondering whether I mean parent-child rather than father-son. And then at the other extreme, we have a low correlation between parental income and children's income, and therefore a high degree of intergenerational economic mobility, so class mobility. So Roberta is wondering, like, what's the difference between father-son and parent-child? So the authors of this study just did father-son decorrelation in order to control for the gender gap in wages that exists in many countries. So like, what if we remove gender from the consideration and just tried to look at father-son as a way to examine overall parent-child correlation? Matthew wonders whether income inequality serves as an incentive to earn a bigger piece of the growing pie. For sure. We can't live in a world of zero income inequality. That's not a world of capitalism. But here's and Jose is chatted in about Peru. Here's the problem. What if there are incentives for people to try hard to earn a bigger piece of this growing pie, as mentioned, but they can't? So let me simplify this chart radically. If you're a Peruvian boy and your Peruvian daddy makes a lot of money, probably you're going to make a lot of money. That's one extreme. The other extreme, if you're a Danish boy and your Danish daddy makes a lot of money, it's got more or less nothing to do with whether you make a lot of money. So that's what this chart is showing across countries. Now, think about the United States, again, just as an example. In the narrative of the US economy that we have, we call it sometimes the American dream. The most dominant idea is that, to put it crudely, it doesn't matter who your daddy is. It's a very individualist narrative. If you succeed, it's because you did it yourself. If you don't succeed, it's your own fault. That's more or less the story we have in the United States. So in the American imagination, the United States should be down below Denmark with a very low correlation between parental income and children's income. But that's not where the United States is. So we can find the United States in this chart next to Switzerland and Pakistan and Argentina with, in fact, a rather high correlation between parental income and children's income, which is to say, in the United States, as is true in Pakistan and Argentina and Switzerland, it matters a lot who your daddy is for how much money you're going to end up making. And I'm not trying to be like judgy about this either. For those of us with children, I don't know how many of you have children. I have two children. I have an 18-year-old and a 14-year-old. Like, the business model of my house is trying to maximize the correlation between my income and my children's income. Atima, it is not news to many, many people that the American dream is a lie, that it's a myth, that it's not true. Of course it's not news. But the sense of frustration about it, about the fact that, just to take myself as an example, and I judge myself about this in some ways, but I do it anyway, which is like, I spend many hours every week thinking about how to correlate highly my income and my children's income with extra violin lessons and extra tutoring sessions and the colossally expensive private school to which I've sent my children. All of this in the same agenda of giving them the best possible chance, knowing full well from the macro story that with a winner-take-all distribution of income, it's going to matter a lot whether you're in the top 1 or the top 5 or the top 10. The problem is, it's not supposed to work as well as it does. The problem is, I shouldn't, at least not by the standard American story, be able essentially to guarantee that my children will make it. And that's what these data are telling us. And so think about the street protests in Chile. Here's another country on our distribution here. That wasn't about just inequality. That was about a sense of unfairness, because unless we think only rich people have smart, hardworking children, which is definitely not true, then this is deeply unfair. And so it's not just that we have rising income inequality, is that in many countries, it is sticky across generations. And Gretchen asks in the Q&A, what is the trend here? Income mobility in most countries is going down rather than up. Stever, honestly. Very funny, indeed. And yes, and widely true, and they'll still be fine, probably. And Michael Sandel's tyranny of merit. Yes, there's a great point, Margaret. Thank you for that. The idea that where you end up in the income distribution only reflects your merit rather than an accident of birth, which is not true in most countries and is definitely not true in the United States, creates resentment on both sides. So for then the people who made it feel like, why are you complaining? I'm paying all these taxes and I made it because I worked hard and because I'm full of merit. And then the people who don't make it are being told that the reason that they didn't was because they didn't have enough merit or because they didn't work hard enough, which is not true statistically. So that's also pulling us apart in some really profound ways. All right, now this, my dear friends, is the nerdiest chart I will show you. And I've already showed you for a few nerdy ones. I think it's the most important one. So way back in the day, you took some classes from a Biggie professor, whether you took RC Biggie or you did Biggie in an executive program, like with me, for example. And somebody described to you what a Gini coefficient was. So Gini coefficient is just another measure of income inequality. And what I've done in this chart is I've taken the Gini coefficients for two countries, the United States and France, and created two versions of them. One is the gross Gini coefficient, which is how much income inequality prevails in a society before the state intervenes, to tax and transfer, before the state intervenes to redistribute income. And then the net Gini coefficient, which is the level of income inequality that prevails in a country after the state intervenes to tax and redistribute income. So if we look at the gross Gini coefficients in the United States and France, both of them have increased by a significant amount over the last 30 years. They look actually very similar. But if we look at the net Gini coefficient, the French economy is actually more equal than it was 30 years ago after the state has intervened to redistribute income from those who have won to those who have not. So net Gini coefficient in France declined over the past 30 years. We'll leave aside the fact, which we don't have time to discuss, that the United States net Gini coefficient increased by even more than the gross Gini coefficient, which tells us that the US taxation system has grown less progressive over time. That's not the big point I want to make here, though. So France has done what many of us on the left have suggested that we do in order to minimize and ameliorate the populist backlash against globalization. So I don't know your politics. You don't know mine, although you know that I'm a Harvard professor. And so you would guess rightly that I'm on the center left of the American political spectrum. I bet in our conversation, we don't have very many people who are on the far left. So like we don't have many communists who come through Harvard Business School. We don't have very many on the faculty. The communists at Harvard are across the Charles River in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. They're not mostly at the business school. And then we probably don't have many far right people on the call either, right? If you think of yourself as being on the right of the political spectrum, probably you think of yourself as being center right rather than far right. And center left and center right can be in robust conversation with one another. Center left has been saying for the last 20 years, look, inequality is going up, people are getting mad about it, income mobility across generations is going down, people are being mad about that. And Garrett, this is the great question. This is why I think this is so important. And this is from the chat. Center left has been saying, people are mad. What we need to do at a minimum is redistribute income from the winners to those who have lost. And if we do that, maybe we can prevent populism from breaking globalization. I thought that for a while too, in full disclosure. And France has delivered to us a natural experiment. They tried it. Like we can see, they tried it. They did as robust an effort to redistribute income from the winners to those who lost as any nation in the world over the last 30 years. They did it. And you know what? It didn't work. So Garrett mentions this in the chat. Gonzague mentions this in the chat. It didn't work. The populist backlash in France is even bigger than it is in the United States. And so what is this telling us? I think it's telling us something quite profound. That we can't buy our way out of this crisis of legitimacy for globalization. We cannot simply tax the winners and redistribute income to those who have lost to pay them off. And what did France get instead? France got 25% youth unemployment, 15% unemployment for some sectors. It's well compensated unemployment, like we're paying them, but we're depriving them of something even more profound. Why do we work at all? I mean, it's great to earn some money, but that's not the main reason we work. We work because we derive a sense of meaning and purpose and satisfaction from our ability to contribute. And then it's great if that's well compensated. But it's not just about the money. What this natural experiment that France has given us is telling us is that this is about not a crisis of a wealth gap, not a crisis of an income gap, but a dignity gap, a crisis of dignity and meaning and purpose in so many people's lives. And if we understand that, then I think we can let go of the idea that I thought once upon a time had a simple answer, which is like, let's just redistribute. It's not going to work. And to be clear, I'm not saying that we definitely shouldn't be redistributing. Like if we want to decide to do that society by society, that's fine with me. We can reduce poverty that way. We can reduce hunger that way. That's fine. That's for societies to choose. But if we try to tell ourselves that that will deliver to us a renewed political legitimacy for globalization, the French story is, I think, at least in my mind, definitive, telling us that that's not going to be good enough. What we need is a comprehensive understanding of the fact that the crisis of globalization is more about dignity than it is about money. And if it's about dignity, then we need to think about what the role is for individual citizens to rethink so much of what we do, what the role is for corporations, what the role is for governments. But it's definitely not just a job for governments, because the main tool that the governments have is to redistribute, and that's not going to be good enough. So let me share a few other thoughts as we begin to think about this. And Atima, indeed, social acceptance, right? So how do we make sure that people feel the dignity that comes from their work, and how do we honor what they're doing? How do we make sure that they find meaning in what they're doing? And all of it has gotten worse during the pandemic. So this is a simple chart that just tries to describe what we all know is true, and these are data from the United States. The higher your income, the more likely you are able to earn money while working remotely. And the lower your income, the less likely you are able to earn money while working remotely. This is true in the United States. It's true across the world. So an era of lockdown for us has been frustrating, I suspect, for basically everybody who's on our conversation today. You know, when you got stuck at home, you were still able to earn money. Maybe not as much, maybe you took an income hit, but basically, yeah, Mark, deaths of despair. It's a great example of this. And I love the debate about like, which is the right word? Maybe it's not dignity, maybe it's humanity, maybe it's meaning, maybe it's purpose, but it's definitely not money. Whatever it is, we know that it's not just about the money. So we stayed home, kept ourselves safe, had all of our stuff delivered, and continued to earn income. An era of lockdown meant in every country, we're depriving people of income. And I'm not saying that as a public health measure, we shouldn't have done lockdowns. Maybe that's right, maybe that's wrong. I think it's basically sensible public health measure. But what is a disaster is to lock people down and then also not do anything else to help them. And if you think about countries in, I don't know, let's take South Africa, for example, which is a country I know pretty well. You lock people down, it means they're not eating. Might be right for public health measures, but because remote work is so highly correlated with income, this is a very redistributive policy, but away from the poor and toward the rich. And this is a chart that just shows the percent of jobs that can be done remotely across countries and how highly correlated that is with national income per capita in those countries. So the richer the country, the greater the percentage of jobs that can be done remotely. The poorer the country, the smaller the percentage of jobs that can be done remotely. And Kwabena posted in the chat about Ghana, absolutely. A lives versus livelihoods debate. Like here, it's like absolutely a crisis. And Roberta, globalization, she mentions in the Q&A, or asks in the Q&A, globalization surely is not an end in itself. What's the guiding objective? Great question. So let's keep our process going and come to, I think, what the point of all of this is. Like, why do we want global capitalism in the first place? Why is it worth saving? I think it is, but why? This is a map of Europe that shows the percentage of jobs that can be done remotely, country by country. You see the United Kingdom and Sweden at about 44%. The United States is about 45%. And you know, you can see from the map how highly correlated the percentage of jobs that can be done remotely is with national income, which is to say, the further north and west you go in Europe, the higher the percentage. The further south and east you go in Europe, the lower the percentage. And then in poor countries, it's down around 10%, 5%. For all of the talk, just as an aside, for all of the talk that we have in the media about the remote work revolution, about how we're all going to be working remotely, how the offices are dead, there's no country in the world, anywhere, that has a majority of jobs that can be done remotely right now. Every country in the world has less than 50%, and most countries have much, much less than 50%. So just as an aside, we're not on the verge of all working remotely because that's a minority of us everywhere. But what this meant was the achievement gap, dignity gap, income gap, wealth gap. Fine. Sorry, Luxembourg, 53%. Yes, okay. So there's one tiny, tiny little country where it's more than 50%, and maybe they'll be okay. Thank you for that. What this means is that every political challenge we had to global capitalism before the pandemic struck was magnified by it. The sense of mistrust of the elites, the sense of mistrust of the establishment, the sense that businesses don't really care about whether growth is inclusive, that the governments aren't doing enough to make sure that we have dignity and meaning and purpose in enough people's lives. It's all become more problematic. And these last couple of charts, just to show the recovery and what it looks like. And again, these are data from the United States because they're really high quality data, but you can just imagine how this looks in other countries. So high wage employment in the United States is already back to pre-pandemic levels. Middle wage employment in the United States is still below pre-pandemic levels, and low wage employment in the United States is a good 25% off of pre-pandemic levels still. So the recovery is uneven within countries, and the effect of the pandemic were very uneven within countries. And this last effect of the pandemic, and these are data again for the United States. I don't have the data yet. This is from a McKinsey study that was, I thought, really well done. So this McKinsey study tried to evaluate whether students in the United States were receiving, in the green bar, average and above average remote instruction, or in the purple one, low quality remote instruction, or the yellow bar, no instruction at all. Like kids just not going to remote school. So if this is true in the United States, think about what it's been like in other countries. So in the United States, 30-ish%, so a third of American students received average and above average remote instruction. 50% really received low quality remote instruction, and 20% none at all. They just stopped going to school. And then looking at this broken down by race and by income, it's like catastrophic. And Atima, this breaks my rather brown heart too. So only 14% of Black kids in the United States received average and above average remote instruction. Almost half received low quality, and 40% of Black children in the United States spent about a year not going to school at all. Look at low income. Elliot, this is about income and public schools versus private schools. So look at low income. 60% of low income students received only low quality remote instruction, and 40% basically none at all. Gretchen, I'd have to ask you to check out this McKinsey study. It's really, really well done. And it's not very easy to measure this, but for those of us with kids, we all know it. Like we all know whether our kids got high quality or low quality remote instruction or none at all. You know, the fancy private school where I've been sending my kids and all my money as well, they did a better job than Harvard did in the transition to remote education. like 100% a better job. And Jamal, you can have all these slides and you can give this talk to anybody who will listen. So for sure, we'll definitely share this with you. And where I live in the town of Wellesley, which is this sort of like adorable suburb outside of Boston. It's got some of the best public schools in the state, and the state has some of the best public schools in the country. And Wellesley High School was a disaster in the transition to remote education, like an utter disaster. And it needn't be, but it was. And that's at one of the best public schools in the country. So think about what this has been for some of the poorer public schools in the country, and then think about what this has been in Peru, or in South Africa, or in Russia, or in Indonesia, like you name it. If this is what happened in the United States, it's worse probably almost everywhere else, except for a few parts of Europe. And these inequalities in education, right, for kids who've been like out of school for 16 months, they're not going to catch up next year, right? They're not going to put themselves back on the path next year. This is like a generational effect we're going to face between the kids who had access to better remote education and those who had worse across the entire world, not just in the United States. So here we are today. We are living through the greatest challenge to the legitimacy of global capitalism that we have lived through since the 1920s and the 1930s. The last time global capitalism broke, we were living through a great power transition in the world, as we are today. The last time the world was as unequal within countries as it is today was in the 1920s, which was the last time globalization broke. The last time we had simultaneously the rise of left-wing populism and right-wing populism, anti-systemic populism within countries was in the 1920s and the 1930s, as we are living through today. The last time we were living through an era of epistemological fragmentation, like the one through which we are living today, was in the 1920s and 1930s as well. All of which is to say, the challenges that broke the last system are the same challenges that we face today, and we are doing a terrible job of managing those challenges so far. And we're not even talking about the right questions. The left is talking about redistributing income. We know that's not going to work. The right is talking about cutting taxes to stimulate further capital accumulation. And we know that's not going to work. I mean, it might be fine for growth, and redistribution might be fine for eliminating poverty, but neither of them will resolve the legitimacy challenge. And it's the legitimacy challenge that is most profound. So Sean O'Connor asks in the chat, like, what about the relationship between globalization and domestic populism? Every populist movement, whether it's left-wing or right-wing, in the United States, across the OECD, is also anti-globalization. Roberta wondered earlier about the connection with political regimes. If we have democratic practices and more than 50% of our fellow citizens believe that the system is deeply unfair, then they will continue to deliver to us politicians and policymakers who are skeptical of the establishment of the elites, of globalization, and of global capitalism. And what is the point of global capitalism in the first place? And we've got some great questions about this. And David Zimmer was wondering whether these numbers are adjusted for pre-pandemic normal attendance, and the answer is yes. No, this is a real effect that we got. And A. Clement, I don't know the first name here. Should most students repeat the lost school year? Maybe, but then they're a year behind. So what is the point of the whole thing? Like, why should we want global capitalism? Leaving aside the fact that we're all interested in it, as am I. I like global capitalism. I want to save globalization. It has its problems. I think we can solve them. I like global capitalism because it brought 500 million Chinese citizens out of poverty and 400 million Indian citizens out of poverty and countless millions of other citizens around the world out of poverty, because it was an opportunity for developing countries to grow and to flourish. It is definitely worth saving. But it is, I think, on the verge of breaking. And so I forget who it was who posted into the Q&A, like, what about a worldwide Gini coefficient? Like, we're just looking at income inequality within nations. Exactly. Income inequality within nations has grown in the vast majority of countries in the world. But if we just erased all sovereign borders and just looked at global income inequality, like human to human, it's gone down over the last 30 years. Because so many other countries have had an opportunity to flourish. So like the global Gini coefficient, gross and net, has been declining for the past 30 years. That's another reason to save globalization. So then the question is, what do we do about it? It's not mostly about taxes, and it's not mostly about money. And then if we recognize that this is a dignity crisis, a meaning crisis, a humanity crisis, a purpose crisis, then I think we can aim our attentions better. And by the way, I'm not sure I know like the answer. If I knew the answer, I would tell you, I promise. Like I would just say like, and here are the 9 things we have to do, then we save global capitalism. I would just tell you, but I don't know. I have some intuitions. And what I would love is for us to think about all of the ways that we can harness our creativity, not just for business, but for saving the system itself. Like, couldn't we spend 10% of all of the extraordinary creativity of the hundreds of people on this call who are doing amazing things in their piece of capitalism and think about what we have to do to change educational systems, what we have to do to create skills-based education and not just university preparatory education, to rethink global, to rethink across the globe vocational training, not just generalist training for kids. There are countries that do this extremely well, Germany and Switzerland among them. Making sure that we have flourishing small and medium-sized enterprises, not just highly concentrated industrial sectors. Making sure that our financial systems support small and medium-sized enterprises, and then connect those small and medium-sized enterprises to highly skilled, but not necessarily university graduate labor force, to make sure that there are places that can flourish in every country, not just the big cities, because we can't just have everybody leave the small towns and rural areas and move to the big cities. What can we do at the political level to rethink what the challenges are? And I think the most important part is to recognize that this challenge is about micro more than it is about macro. It's about dignity and purpose and meaning, and connecting macro to micro. Like when we think about leadership within organizations and what makes the people who work with us and for us satisfied with their work, we know from like 30 years of surveys and data and scholarship, people enjoy their work and find it meaningful when they believe 2 things. One, that it's worthwhile, and the other is that their bosses care about them. It's not about paying them more or less. Money helps a little bit, but that's not what the data tell us. Everything we know about leadership is about meaning and purpose and dignity and caring. So then why is it when we talk about the macro issues like saving globalization, we start talking just about money, about taxes and redistribution, and not about the things that we know for sure inside organizations make for flourishing cultures. So it's time to connect macro and micro. And if we're going to save globalization, we're going to save it from the ground up, not from the top down. If we wait for our national governments to solve these problems, we will have waited too long. Because this crisis is acute. We need to start thinking like now, and by now I mean tomorrow. What are we going to do to revitalize how the schools in our communities serve the educational needs of our children that include skills and vocations? What are we going to do now in local governance to mentor entrepreneurs, to finance entrepreneurs, to create public-private partnerships between local firms and local banks and local politics? What are we going to do now beyond giving money away that can restore an inclusive globalization? To make it feel like it's worthwhile, any system that a majority of people feel does not benefit them is not a system that is going to last. And that's where we're living right now. Majorities of citizens believe this system does not benefit them. This is not a marketing problem. This is not about like sending a nerdy Rawi around countries trying to explain how globalization is actually a good thing. No, it actually has to be experienced that way. And this is going to happen from the center. From the center of the political spectrum. What can we do to revitalize the center of the political spectrum? The answers are not going to come from far left. The answers are not going to come from far right. The answers are not going to come from populism. The agendas of populism most likely will make the situation worse. So I mentioned, my guess is most of you are center left or center right, and I'm center left. And if you're center right, we can talk about this, but we need to revitalize the center of the political spectrum to make the center seem sexy and interesting and forward looking again, not the status quo. People are done with the status quo. And if the center of the political spectrum means the status quo, then we're in big trouble. So just to conclude, and this a bit of poetry to share with you in a few images. Turning and turning in the widening gyre. The falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. Which is how it feels a little bit to me right now, that the best lack conviction and the worst are full of passionate intensity, and boy, are they loud. But what about this? How about not on our watch? Like, I don't know all of you, but I know some of you. And I know that you are among the best. You are deeply empathic, caring leaders who believe in shared prosperity, who believe in the dignity and honor of the people who work with you and for you. You believe in contributing, you believe in making the world a better place. And we have got to be louder. We've got to bring our passionate intensity to this problem. And if we don't, and the system comes crashing down, then we will have no one to blame but ourselves. So let's not do that. This is not about talking. This is about acting and like starting tomorrow. What are we going to do? With this frame in mind, where can we restore the dignity and honor that is essential for a flourishing capitalist system? So I put my email in the chat, and I hope all of you will keep in touch, and I would love to be part of these conversations. And if there's anything I can ever do to be part of a conversation, if you think I can be helpful, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. This is going to be some of our most important work. I will ask now our alumni hosts to rejoin the call and just share one further thought as they do, and they conclude this conversation, which is, for many of us, we thought that our biggest leadership tests came during the pandemic. And maybe that's true. But what I'd like to suggest is actually the biggest leadership tests of our lives is starting now, after the pandemic, dealing with the aftermath of it, and rethinking and reimagining what global capitalism can be. Thank you.